In the fading light of the 15th century, as twilight settled across the vast expanse of the Indian subcontinent, the land breathed with the rhythm of countless kingdoms, each rising and falling like waves upon an endless shore. The air itself seemed heavy with the weight of empires that had come and gone, leaving behind only whispers in stone and memory. From the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush to the warm waters that lapped the southern coasts, India existed as a tapestry of power, woven from threads of ambition, faith, and the eternal human desire to build something lasting in a world of constant change. The Delhi Sultanate, once mighty as a monsoon storm, had fragmented into smaller kingdoms, like raindrops scattered by the wind. In the north, the Lodi dynasty ruled from Delhi with the uncertain grip of autumn leaves clinging to their branches, knowing that winter winds would eventually shake them loose. Sultan Sikandar Lodi walked the marble corridors of his palace with the measured steps of a man who understood that power was as ephemeral as morning mist, beautiful and commanding in its moment, yet destined to dissolve with the rising sun. His courtiers moved around him with the careful grace of dancers who knew their performance might end at any moment, their silk robes rustling like the whisper of pages turning in the great book of history. To the south, in the Deccan Plateau, where the earth rose in gentle swells like a sleeping giant's chest, the Bahmani Sultanate had splintered into 5 successor states, each ruling their domains with the fierce independence of mountain streams that refuse to merge until they reach the sea. The rulers of Bijapur, Golconda, Ahmadnagar, Berar, and Bidar built their courts with exquisite care, surrounding themselves with poets whose words flowed like honey, architects whose visions reached toward heaven, and scholars whose libraries held the accumulated wisdom of centuries. In the evening hours, when the heat of the day finally relented and cool breezes carried the scent of jasmine through palace gardens, these kings would sit in contemplation, perhaps sensing that their time was but a brief interlude in a much larger story waiting to unfold. Further south still, beyond the Deccan's rolling hills, the great empire of Vijayanagara stood like a lighthouse against the darkness of uncertainty. Its capital city spread across the landscape with the confident sprawl of a civilization sure of its place in the world, its temples rising toward the sky like prayers made manifest in stone. The Sangama dynasty had given way to the Saluvars, who ruled with the steady hand of farmers tending an ancient field, knowing that patient cultivation would yield the richest harvest. In the shadow of those temples, merchants from distant lands was gathered in bazaars where the air shimmered with heat and possibility, their voices creating a symphony of commerce that had echoed across these stones for generations. But perhaps nowhere was the sense of ending and beginning more palpable than in the mountainous lands of Central Asia, where the descendants of great conquerors lived among the ruins of their ancestors' ambitions. Here, in the valleys of Fergana and the ancient cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, the legacy of Timur, Tamerlane the Great, cast long shadows across the landscape like the silhouette of a giant against the setting sun. His empire had crumbled with the inevitability of an avalanche, leaving behind scattered principalities where his descendants ruled over fragments of former glory, each prince dreaming of restoration, while winter winds whispered through the empty halls of abandoned palaces. Among these princes moved a young man whose name would one day echo through the corridors of history like the call of a muezzin at dawn. Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad, who would come to be known as Babur, walked the high mountain passes with the restless energy of someone who carried within his heart both the memory of vanished greatness and the seeds of future empire. Born in 1483 in Andijan, a city nestled in the Fergana Valley like a jewel in a mountain crown, he was descended through his father from Timur and through his mother from Genghis Khan, a lineage that flowed in his veins like two mighty rivers joining to create something new and powerful. The world that shaped young Babur was one of constant motion, where armies moved across the landscape like clouds driven by invisible winds, and loyalty shifted as quickly as shadows at noon. From his palace windows in Fergana, he could see the snow-capped peaks that had witnessed the passage of Alexander the Great, the rise and fall of the Kushan Empire, the thundering hooves of Mongol cavalry, and the disciplined march of Timur's armies. Each morning brought news of shifting alliances, of cities won and lost, of dreams realized and then swept away by the next tide of ambition. The cities of Central Asia, in those days, possessed a quality of light that seemed almost otherworldly, as if the thin mountain air allowed the sun to shine with particular clarity on the domes and minarets that rose like prayers toward heaven. Samarkand, the jewel of Timur's empire, still glowed with the blue brilliance of its tilework, though cracks had begun to appear in its perfect surfaces, like the first lines on an aging face. In its madrasas, scholars debated questions of theology and philosophy, while outside their windows, merchants led caravans loaded with silk and spices along routes that connected the Mediterranean with the Far East, their bells chiming a melody that had remained unchanged for centuries. But change was coming, as inevitable as the turning of seasons. The great age of the Silk Road was drawing to a close as Portuguese navigators discovered sea routes that would make the overland passages less vital to global trade. The Ottoman Empire was expanding eastward, bringing new ideas and new pressures to bear on the traditional powers of Central Asia. In distant Europe, the Renaissance was flowering, bringing with it innovations in warfare, art and governance that would eventually reach even these remote mountain valleys. And in the courts of Central Asian princes, a new generation was coming of age, young men who had inherited their ancestors' pride, but not their power, their ambition, but not their secure foundations. Babur himself embodied this tension between past and future, tradition and innovation. He had learned to read the great Persian poets, could quote verses from Ferdowsi's Shahnameh with the fluency of a court scholar, and understood the intricate protocols of diplomacy that governed relationships between princes. Yet he also possessed a practical intelligence that allowed him to adapt to changing circumstances with the flexibility of water finding its way around obstacles. When he lost his ancestral kingdom of Fergana to rivals, he did not retreat into melancholy, but began to dream of other possibilities, other kingdoms waiting to be claimed by someone bold enough to reach for them. The military technology of the time was undergoing its own transformation, as gunpowder weapons began to supplement the traditional weapons of cavalry warfare. The great composite bow, which had been the signature weapon of steppe warriors for millennia, was gradually giving way to matchlocks and cannon, though the transition was neither quick nor complete. Armies still moved with the seasonal rhythm that had governed warfare since ancient times, campaigning in the months when grass was available for horses, and returning to winter quarters when snow made mountain passes impassable. The sound of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth remained the music of military power, accompanied now by the deeper percussion of cannon and the sharp crack of gunfire. In the courts of these kingdoms, whether in Delhi or Fergana, Bijapur or Bukhara, the same patterns of palace life unfolded with ritualistic precision. Dawn would find the rulers in their private chambers, beginning the day with prayers that rose like incense toward heaven, seeking divine guidance for the decisions that would shape the fate of thousands. As the sun climbed higher, audiences would commence in great halls where supplicants approached the throne with the careful steps of pilgrims approaching a shrine, their petitions and complaints forming a river of human need that flowed endlessly toward the seat of power. The evenings brought different pleasures and different responsibilities. In gardens where fountains played among beds of roses and jasmine, kings would gather with their closest counselors to discuss the intelligence that had arrived with the day's messengers. Maps would be unrolled on marble tables, their surfaces marked with the shifting boundaries of influence and alliance. Poets would recite verses that captured both the beauty of the moment and the larger themes of human existence: love and loss, ambition and acceptance, the eternal cycle of rise and fall that governed the fate of individuals and empires alike. Yet beneath this surface of cultured refinement, everyone could sense the approaching transformation. The old certainties were crumbling like ancient walls undermined by time and weather. Trade routes that had enriched cities for centuries were being bypassed by new maritime passages. Military technologies that had remained stable for generations were evolving with unprecedented speed. Religious and cultural boundaries that had seemed fixed were beginning to blur as increased contact between civilizations brought new ideas and new challenges to traditional ways of life. In this world of magnificent uncertainty, where every sunset seemed to mark the end of an age and every dawn the possible beginning of another, the stage was being set for one of history's great dramas. The characters were taking their positions: ambitious princes in mountain fortresses, established sultans in ancient capitals, warrior monks and merchant princes, scholars and soldiers, dreamers and pragmatists. The props were being arranged: cannon and cavalry, poetry and politics, faith and skepticism, tradition and innovation. And somewhere in the wings, a young man named Babur was preparing to make his entrance onto the stage of history, carrying within himself the seeds of an empire that would grow to encompass much of the Indian subcontinent and leave its mark on the world for centuries to come. The monsoon winds that would soon carry Babur's armies from the mountains of Afghanistan to the plains of Hindustan were already stirring, gathering strength for the journey ahead. In the cities and courts, the palaces and camps, the temples and mosques, the caravanserais and battlefields of this vast region, the final act of the old order was drawing to a close. The curtain was about to rise on the age of the Mughals, though few who lived through those final years of the 15th century could have imagined the grandeur and tragedy that lay ahead. The magnificent palaces that would rise and fall, the borders that would expand and contract like a great heart beating across the centuries, the art and architecture that would transform the very landscape of India, and the ultimate price that would be paid for the ambitions of kings who dreamed of ruling forever in a world where nothing lasts except the memory of what once was beautiful and strong. The year 1526 dawned with the soft light of promise across the dusty plains of northern India, though few could have foreseen that this would be the year when the old order would finally give way to something entirely new. In the pre-dawn darkness, as the last stars faded from the sky like candles being gently extinguished, two armies faced each other near the town of Panipat, their campfires flickering like earth-bound constellations. The air was still and heavy with anticipation, carrying the scent of wood smoke and horses, leather and steel, the accumulated breath of thousands of men who knew that daybreak would bring either victory or death. On one side of this fateful field lay the forces of Ibrahim Lodi, Sultan of Delhi, arrayed in all the traditional splendor of medieval Indian warfare. His elephants stood like living fortresses in the growing light, their massive forms decorated with silk and gold, their tusks gleaming like ivory spears. Behind them stretched ranks of cavalry and infantry that seemed to flow across the landscape like a vast, colorful tide. The Sultan himself rode among his men with the confident bearing of one who had never known defeat, his armor catching the first rays of sunlight like a mirror reflecting the glory of centuries of Muslim rule in India. Facing this impressive host stood a much smaller force, but one that carried within its ranks the seeds of revolution. Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad Babur, descendant of Timur and Genghis Khan, had descended from the mountain passes with an army that combined the traditional mobility of Central Asian warfare with innovations that would change the face of military conflict in India forever. His cannon, still a novelty in Indian warfare, crouched behind earthen barriers like sleeping dragons waiting to awaken. His matchlock-armed infantry stood in disciplined ranks that spoke of training and preparation, while his cavalry retained all the fluid grace of their steppe ancestors. Babur himself moved among his men in those final hours before battle with the calm presence of someone who had wagered everything on this single throw of dice. At 43, he had already lived through more adventures than most men experience in several lifetimes. He had won and lost kingdoms, had been exiled and restored, had tasted both the honey of victory and the bitter herb of defeat. His face, weathered by years of campaign and hardship, bore the lines of a man who had learned to find beauty in the midst of struggle, who could compose poetry between battles and appreciate the delicate architecture of a flower while planning the siege of a city. When the sun finally rose over Panipat, its light revealed not just two armies about to clash, but two different concepts of warfare, two different visions of power, two different ages of history meeting in violent collision. The battle itself unfolded with the terrible beauty of a thunderstorm, all sound and fury and flashing light. Ibrahim Lodi's elephants charged with the irresistible force of an avalanche, their trumpeting filling the air like the voices of ancient gods. But Babur's cannon spoke with a voice that had never been heard on an Indian battlefield, their roar echoing across the plain like thunder that refused to fade. By evening, when the dust had settled and the screams had died away, a new chapter in Indian history had begun. Ibrahim Lodi lay dead among his fallen warriors, and Babur stood victorious on a field that stretched away toward Delhi, like a carpet unrolled at his feet. The Mughal Empire had been born in that moment, though it would take years of struggle and consolidation before its true character would be revealed. As night fell over Panipat, Babur walked among the aftermath of his triumph, his steps measured and thoughtful, perhaps understanding already that conquest was only the beginning of a much more complex and demanding task. The occupation of Delhi that followed was like watching sunrise break over a city that had been waiting in darkness for centuries. Babur entered the ancient capital with the careful steps of someone taking possession, not just of buildings and treasure, but of dreams and responsibilities that stretched back through the mists of time. The throne of the sultans, which had seemed so solid and permanent to those who had occupied it, proved to be as temporary as morning dew. Yet in taking his seat upon it, Babur was not simply replacing one ruler with another. He was beginning the transformation of an entire civilization. The early years of Mughal rule were marked by the constant tension between consolidation and expansion, between the need to secure what had been won and the irresistible pull of new horizons. Babur moved through his new domain like a gardener tending a vast estate, sometimes pruning back rebellion, sometimes planting the seeds of new institutions, always aware that the garden he was creating would outlive him and require constant care from future generations. His court became a meeting place where the traditions of Central Asia blended with the customs of India, where Persian poetry was recited in halls that had once echoed with Sanskrit verses, where the administrative systems developed in Samarkand and Bukhara adapted themselves to the very different challenges of governing the Gangetic Plain. But even as Babur worked to establish his new empire, time moved with the relentless inevitability of a river flowing toward the sea. In 1530, at the age of 47, he died in Agra, leaving behind a kingdom that was still more potential than reality, more dream than solid achievement. His tomb, built in the Kabul that he had always loved best among all his conquered cities, would eventually become a place of pilgrimage for those who understood that empires begin not with grand proclamations, but with the quiet determination of individuals who refuse to accept the limitations imposed by their circumstances. The crown that Babur left to his son Humayun was beautiful but heavy, like a jeweled burden that promised both glory and suffering to whoever wore it. Humayun, whose name meant fortunate, would discover that fortune is a tide that ebbs and flows according to laws that mortals can influence but never fully control. He inherited not only his father's conquests, but also his father's restless spirit, his love of learning and beauty, his determination to build something lasting in a world where everything seemed destined to crumble into dust. The early years of Humayun's reign unfolded like a complex musical composition, full of themes and variations, moments of harmony, and passages of discord. He moved through the palaces of Agra and Delhi with the graceful bearing of someone educated in the finest traditions of Persian court culture, equally at home, discussing the mysteries of astronomy with learned scholars, or planning military campaigns with grizzled veterans of his father's wars. His court became a center of intellectual ferment, where ideas flowed between minds like water between vessels, enriching everyone who participated in the exchange. Yet beneath this surface of cultural flowering, Humayun faced challenges that would have daunted even the most capable ruler. The Afghan nobles who had served the Lodi dynasty had not simply vanished with their sultan's defeat. They had regrouped under the leadership of Sher Shah Suri, a man whose military genius would prove equal to any that the Mughals could field. The Rajput princes, those proud descendants of warrior clans whose legends stretched back to the age of heroes, watched the new dynasty with the calculating gaze of eagles assessing potential prey. Most dangerous of all, perhaps, were Humayun's own brothers, each of whom possessed enough ambition and ability to rule in his own right, each of whom represented a potential alternative to the established succession. The 1530s and 1540s became a period when the very survival of the Mughal dynasty hung in the balance like a sword suspended by a thread. Sher Shah Suri proved to be an opponent worthy of Babur himself, combining strategic brilliance with administrative skill and the kind of personal charisma that could inspire men to follow him into the mouth of hell. His Afghan supporters fought with the fierce pride of mountaineers defending their homeland, while his Hindu allies brought their own traditions of warfare and governance to strengthen his cause. When Sher Shah finally defeated Humayun at the Battle of Chausa in 1539, the sound of Mughal defeat echoed across the plains of India like thunder announcing the approach of a devastating storm. The years of exile that followed were perhaps the most formative of Humayun's life, transforming him from a cultured prince into something approaching the kind of leader his father had been. Driven from his kingdom like a character in an epic poem, he wandered through the courts of Sindh and Rajasthan, seeking allies and support with the desperate dignity of a king without a country. His small band of followers remained loyal through years when loyalty seemed to promise nothing but continued hardship, their faith in his ultimate restoration sustained by something deeper than mere hope, a belief in the fundamental justice of his cause and the inevitable turning of fortune's wheel. It was during these years of wandering that Humayun deepened his understanding of the land he hoped to rule. He saw India not from the elevated perspective of a throne room, but from the roads and markets, the temples and caravanserais where ordinary people lived their lives. He learned to appreciate the incredible diversity of the subcontinent, its multitude of languages and customs, its complex web of relationships between different communities and different faiths. Most importantly, perhaps, he began to understand that the Mughal Empire, if it were to survive and flourish, would need to become something more than simply another foreign dynasty imposed upon a reluctant population. The Persian court, where Humayun finally found refuge, was itself a marvel of artistic and intellectual achievement, a place where the traditions of Islamic civilization had reached a level of refinement that seemed to make beauty itself a form of worship. Shah Tahmasp, received the exiled Mughal emperor with the courtesy due to a fellow descendant of great conquerors, but also with the careful calculation of a ruler who understood that today's refugee might become tomorrow's valuable ally. In the gardens of Isfahan and the libraries of Qazvin, Humayun found both solace and inspiration, surrounding himself with scholars and artists whose influence would later enrich the court culture of the restored Mughal Empire. The army that Shah Tahmasp eventually provided for Humayun's restoration was relatively small, but it was equipped with the latest military technology and commanded by officers who had learned their trade in the Persian wars against the Ottomans. More importantly, perhaps, it represented a recognition that the Mughal Empire served Persian interests by providing a buffer against Ottoman expansion eastward. When Humayun finally began his march back toward India in 1554, he was no longer simply a displaced prince seeking to recover his inheritance. He had become the leader of a carefully planned strategic operation designed to reshape the balance of power across the entire region. The death of Sher Shah Suri in 1545 had created the kind of succession crisis that ambitious exiles dream about. The Afghan empire that had seemed so solid and threatening began to fragment as different claimants to Sher Shah's legacy fought each other with the same intensity they had once directed against Mughal rule. By the time Humayun crossed the passes from Afghanistan into India, he found a political landscape that had been thoroughly transformed by nearly a decade of civil war. Cities had changed hands multiple times, old alliances had been shattered and reformed, and everyone seemed to be looking for a strong leader who could restore stability to a region exhausted by constant conflict. The Battle of Sirhind in 1555 marked Humayun's return to the throne of Delhi, but it was a very different throne from the one he had lost 15 years earlier. The emperor who entered his capital city in triumph was no longer the cultured prince who had been driven into exile. He had become a tested leader who understood both the possibilities and the limitations of imperial power. His restoration was greeted with the kind of cautious optimism that people reserve for the end of a long and bitter winter. Relief mixed with uncertainty about what the coming season might bring. Yet even as Humayun worked to consolidate his restored empire, fate was preparing one final test of his resilience. In January 1556, less than a year after his triumphant return to Delhi, he died in an accident so mundane that it seemed to mock the grand sweep of his life's adventures. Descending the stairs of his library while carrying an armload of books, he stumbled and fell, his head striking the stone steps with fatal force. His death was like the snuffing out of a candle, just as it had begun to burn with steady flame, leaving the nascent Mughal Empire in the hands of a 13-year-old boy who would have to prove himself worthy of a crown that had already cost so much blood and treasure to secure. The funeral procession that carried Humayun to his tomb in Delhi moved through streets lined with mourners who understood that they were witnessing the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The man they buried had been both more and less than a great emperor, more because his struggles had given him a depth of character that purely successful rulers often lack, less because his reign had been too brief and interrupted to achieve the transformative changes that the empire required. Yet in dying when he did, Humayun may have performed his greatest service to the dynasty he loved, clearing the way for a successor whose reign would justify all the sacrifices that had gone before. The crown that passed to young Akbar was no longer simply the inheritance left by a successful conqueror. It had become something richer and more complex, a symbol of resilience tested by adversity, of dreams that refused to die even when their dreamers fell. The Mughal Empire that would emerge from the crucible of Humayun's reign would be stronger and more enduring than anything Babur or Humayun themselves had imagined possible. But that transformation still lay in the future, waiting to unfold like a flower that blooms only after winter has tested the strength of its roots. For now, as the 1550s drew to a close, the empire stood at another crossroads, ready to be shaped by whatever qualities its new ruler would bring to the awesome responsibility of governing one of the world's great civilizations. In the gentle hours before dawn, on a February morning in 1556, when the last stars were fading from the sky like silver coins dropped into dark water, a 13-year-old boy named Jalal-ud-Din Muhammad received news that would change not only his own life, but the destiny of an entire subcontinent. His father, the Emperor Humayun, had died in an accident so ordinary that it seemed to reduce the grand drama of empire to the simple fragility of human existence. Young Akbar, for that was the name by which history would remember him, stood in the grey light of early morning and felt the weight of a crown settling upon his shoulders like the embrace of fate itself. He was barely old enough to grow a beard, yet circumstances demanded that he assume responsibility for an empire that stretched from the mountains of Afghanistan to the sacred rivers of northern India. The coronation that followed was both magnificent and precarious, a ceremony designed to project strength, while everyone present understood how fragile that strength actually was. In the great courtyard of the Purana Qila in Delhi, where the morning sun cast long shadows across ancient stones, the young emperor received the homage of nobles who had served his grandfather and father, their heads bowed in submission that was as much hope as loyalty. The drums that announced his accession rolled across the city like thunder, but beneath their confident rhythm lay an undertone of uncertainty that only the most experienced courtiers could detect. An empire ruled by a boy king was like a ship sailing into a storm with an untested captain at the helm. It might reach safe harbor through luck and good counsel, or it might founder on the first reef it encountered. The regent appointed to guide Akbar through these dangerous early years was Bairam Khan, a general whose loyalty to the Mughal dynasty had been forged in the crucible of Humayun's exile and tested in the fires of his restoration. Bairam Khan moved through the halls of power with the careful confidence of a chess master who could see several moves ahead, his very presence a reassurance to those who wondered whether the empire could survive another period of uncertainty. He understood that the next few years would determine whether the Mughal dynasty would establish itself as a permanent feature of Indian politics or join the long list of foreign rulers who had briefly held power before being swept away by the tides of history. The threat that emerged to test this fragile new reign came from an unexpected quarter. Hemu, a Hindu general who had risen through the ranks of the Sur dynasty through pure merit and determination, had managed to unite much of northern India under his banner in the chaos following Humayun's death. His army moved across the landscape like a flood, carrying away the scattered forces that remained loyal to the Mughals and threatening to wash away everything that Babur and Humayun had built. When news reached Delhi that Hemu had defeated a Mughal army and was marching on the capital itself, the young emperor's councillors gathered in emergency session like physicians consulting over a patient whose life hung in the balance. The decision to meet Hemu in battle at Panipat, the same field where Babur had won his great victory 30 years earlier, carried symbolic weight that everyone understood. It was as if history itself was demanding that the Mughals prove their worth on the same ground where their dynasty had been born. As the two armies deployed in the cool air of November 1556, the very landscape seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether the wheel of fortune would complete another full turn or spin off in an entirely new direction. Young Akbar rode among his troops on the morning of the battle with a bearing that belied his youth, his presence somehow managing to project both the inexperience of boyhood and the destiny of greatness. The soldiers who looked upon him saw not just their emperor, but the embodiment of their hopes for the future, the living symbol of a dynasty that promised to bring order to a land that had known too much chaos. When an arrow struck Hemu in the eye at the height of the battle, causing his forces to waver and then break, it seemed to many that divine providence had intervened to preserve the Mughal throne for the young ruler who would make it the foundation of one of history's greatest empires. The victory at the Second Battle of Panipat marked the true beginning of Akbar's reign. But it was only the first step in a journey that would transform him from a boy king dependent on his regent into one of the most remarkable rulers in the annals of human civilization. As the years passed and Akbar gradually assumed full control of his government, those who knew him began to recognize that they were witnessing the emergence of something extraordinary. Not just another competent emperor, but a leader whose vision would expand the very conception of what an empire could be and do. The process by which Akbar freed himself from the regency of Bairam Khan was handled with such skill and diplomacy that it served as an early indication of the political genius that would characterize his entire reign. Rather than simply dismissing a man who had served the dynasty faithfully, Akbar managed the transition in a way that preserved Bairam Khan's dignity while making clear that the emperor was now ready to rule in his own right. It was a delicate dance of power and respect, conducted with the grace of someone who understood that true authority comes not from the ability to crush opposition, but from the wisdom to transform potential enemies into allies. With the reins of government firmly in his own hands, Akbar began to reveal the qualities that would make him one of history's most successful empire builders. His mind seemed to work on multiple levels simultaneously, capable of focusing on immediate military necessities, while also contemplating the long-term structural changes needed to create a stable and prosperous state. He possessed the warrior's courage necessary for personal leadership in battle, but he also had the administrator's patience required for the slow work of building institutions that would outlast any individual ruler. Most remarkably, perhaps, he combined an almost mystical faith in his own destiny with a pragmatic understanding of human nature that allowed him to work effectively with people whose backgrounds and beliefs were radically different from his own. The military campaigns that marked the middle years of Akbar's reign unfolded across the map of India like the movements of a master choreographer arranging a dance of conquest and consolidation. Each new territory that was added to the empire brought its own challenges and opportunities, its own populations to be governed and traditions to be accommodated. The siege of Chittor in 1567–68 demonstrated Akbar's ability to conduct complex military operations against enemies who fought with the desperate courage of those defending their most sacred beliefs. The Rajput fortress, perched on its rocky hill like an eagle's nest, built to defy the very concept of surrender, had withstood numerous previous assaults by Muslim armies. Yet Akbar's combination of patience, technology, and strategic vision eventually wore down even this most formidable of defensive positions. The fall of Chittor might have been simply another addition to the long list of cities taken by siege, but Akbar transformed it into something more significant. A demonstration that the Mughal Empire was strong enough to defeat any opponent, yet wise enough to offer generous terms to those who chose cooperation over continued resistance. Rather than treating the Rajput princes as conquered enemies to be humiliated and suppressed, he began the revolutionary policy of incorporating them into the Mughal nobility as partners in the imperial enterprise. It was a strategy that required enormous confidence in his own authority and remarkable insight into the psychology of proud warriors who had spent centuries fighting against Muslim rule. The conquest of Gujarat in 1573 showcased a different aspect of Akbar's genius, his ability to move with lightning speed when circumstances demanded rapid action. When rebellion threatened to detach this wealthy province from Mughal control, Akbar responded with a campaign that covered hundreds of miles in just 11 days, a feat of logistics and leadership that left his enemies no time to prepare an effective defense. The emperor himself led the advance guard, sharing the hardships of forced marches and sleeping under the stars with his soldiers, demonstrating the kind of personal courage and identification with his troops that creates unshakable loyalty. The rebels who had expected to have weeks or months to organize their resistance found themselves facing the imperial army before they had even completed their preparations for war. Yet it was perhaps in his conquest of Bengal that Akbar most clearly revealed his understanding of the complex relationship between military power and political authority. Bengal, with its lush river valleys and ancient traditions of learning and culture, represented one of the richest and most sophisticated regions of the Indian subcontinent. Its incorporation into the Mughal Empire required not just military success, but the kind of administrative finesse that could accommodate local customs and power structures while establishing imperial control. The campaign that brought Bengal under Mughal rule stretched over several years and involved not just battles and sieges, but a complex process of negotiation and accommodation that turned potential enemies into willing subjects. Throughout these years of expansion, Akbar was simultaneously working to create the administrative structures that would hold his growing empire together. The Mansabdari system that he developed represented a revolutionary approach to imperial organization, one that combined the traditional Central Asian concept of personal loyalty to the ruler with innovative methods for ensuring that officials remained accountable to the central government. Under this system, imperial servants held ranks, mansabs, that determined both their status and their obligations. But these ranks were not hereditary and had to be maintained through continued service and demonstrated competence. It was a meritocracy overlaid upon a traditional monarchy, a system that allowed for rapid promotion for talented individuals while maintaining the emperor's ultimate authority over all appointments and dismissals. The religious policy that emerged during Akbar's reign was perhaps even more revolutionary than his administrative innovations. In an age when religious orthodoxy was considered essential to political legitimacy, Akbar began to develop an approach to governance that emphasized practical effectiveness over theological purity. The policy of sulh-i-kul, universal peace, that he gradually implemented represented a fundamental departure from the traditional Muslim approach to ruling non-Muslim populations. Rather than treating his Hindu, Jain, Christian and Zoroastrian subjects as temporary inconveniences to be converted or at best tolerated, Akbar began to see religious diversity as a source of strength that could enrich the empire, both culturally and economically. The debates that took place in Akbar's Ibadat Khana, the house of worship that he built at Fatehpur Sikri, became legendary throughout the Islamic world and beyond. Here, in halls lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls, decorated with verses from multiple sacred traditions, scholars and mystics from different faiths gathered to discuss the fundamental questions of human existence. Sufi masters shared their insights with Hindu yogis. Christian missionaries debated theology with Zoroastrian priests, and Jain monks explained their principles of non-violence to Muslim generals who had spent their lives in warfare. Akbar himself presided over these gatherings with the eager curiosity of someone who genuinely believed that truth could be found in many different forms, and that a wise ruler should be open to wisdom regardless of its source. The architectural monuments that Akbar commissioned during his reign served as physical manifestations of his inclusive vision of empire. Fatehpur Sikri, the magnificent capital city that he built near Agra, combined elements from Persian, Indian, and Central Asian architectural traditions in a synthesis that had never been attempted before. Its red sandstone buildings rose from the Rajasthani landscape like a dream made manifest in stone, their courtyards and gardens designed to create spaces where people from different backgrounds could gather in comfort and dignity. The Buland Darwaza, the great gateway that proclaimed the empire's victories to all who approached, stood as tall as a mountain, yet welcomed visitors with the graceful proportions of a work of art. In its shadow, merchants and scholars, soldiers and artists, mystics and administrators moved through the daily business of empire with the easy familiarity of people who belonged to something larger and more enduring than themselves. The court that gathered around Akbar at Fatehpur Sikri became a microcosm of the diverse empire he was creating. The Navratnas, the 9 jewels of his court, included not only Muslim nobles and scholars, but also Hindu ministers like Todar Mal, whose administrative genius helped create the revenue system that would fund the empire's expansion, and Raja Man Singh, the Rajput general whose military skills proved that cooperation between Hindu and Muslim elites could benefit everyone involved. The conversations that flowed through the palace corridors were conducted in multiple languages: Persian and Hindi, Arabic and Sanskrit, Turkish, and the various regional tongues that reflected the incredible linguistic diversity of the subcontinent. It was a court where a Hindu musician might perform ragas that had been passed down through generations of temple tradition, followed by a Persian poet reciting verses that captured the mystical insights of Sufi philosophy, followed by a Jesuit missionary explaining the theological principles of Christianity to an audience that listened with genuine curiosity rather than defensive hostility. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Akbar's reign was the way he managed to combine this cultural openness with the practical necessities of governing a vast and diverse empire. The Ain-i-Akbari, the detailed administrative manual compiled by his minister Abul Fazl, reveals the extraordinary attention to detail that characterized Mughal governance under Akbar's leadership. Every aspect of imperial administration was carefully regulated and documented, from the methods used to assess agricultural taxes to the protocols governing diplomatic relations with foreign powers. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by officials who reported directly to the emperor, but who were also expected to maintain detailed records of their activities that could be audited by imperial inspectors. It was a system that combined centralized authority with local flexibility, allowing the empire to adapt to regional variations while maintaining overall coherence and direction. The economic prosperity that flourished under Akbar's rule was both a cause and a consequence of his political success. The trade routes that connected India with Central Asia, the Middle East and Southeast Asia carried not only goods, but also ideas, technologies, and cultural influences that enriched the empire in ways that went far beyond mere material wealth. The workshops of Agra and Delhi produced textiles, metalwork, and other crafts that were prized throughout the known world, while the agricultural surplus generated by the empire's efficient revenue system provided the foundation for urban growth and cultural flowering. The coins minted during Akbar's reign bore inscriptions that proclaimed not only his political authority, but also his commitment to justice and his recognition of divine guidance in human affairs. The marriages that Akbar contracted during his reign were as much matters of state policy as personal choice, but they also reflected his broader vision of an empire that could accommodate and celebrate diversity rather than simply imposing uniformity. His marriage to Rajput princesses was initially seen by Orthodox Muslims as a dangerous compromise with Hindu customs, but Akbar understood that these alliances would create bonds of kinship and mutual interest that would make the empire stronger and more stable than any amount of military coercion could achieve. The children born from these marriages, including the future emperor Jahangir, would embody in their very persons the synthesis of different traditions that Akbar was working to create throughout his domains. The religious movement that emerged around Akbar's court in his later years, the Din-i-Ilahi, or divine faith, represented perhaps the most ambitious attempt in pre-modern history to create a syncretic religions that could unite people of different backgrounds in common worship and shared values. Drawing elements from Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Jainism, this new faith emphasized ethical behavior, rational inquiry, and personal devotion to the emperor as God's representative on earth. While the Din-i-Ilahi never attracted a large following and did not survive Akbar's death, it demonstrated the emperor's willingness to think beyond conventional categories and his belief that religious truth was too important to be monopolized by any single tradition. The military innovations that characterized Akbar's reign were as revolutionary as his religious and administrative policies. The introduction of standardized artillery units, the development of more effective siege techniques, and the integration of different types of troops into flexible, combined arms formations gave Mughal armies a significant technological and tactical advantage over their opponents. Yet Akbar understood that military success depended not just on superior weapons and tactics, but on the morale and loyalty of the soldiers who wielded them. His practice of sharing the hardships of campaign life with his troops, his generous rewards for courage and service, and his policy of incorporating former enemies into his own forces created an army that fought not just for pay, but for a cause they believed in. The diplomatic relations that Akbar maintained with neighboring powers demonstrated his understanding that even the strongest empire needed friends and allies to ensure its long-term security and prosperity. His correspondence with the Safavid rulers of Persia, the Ottoman sultans, and the Portuguese colonial authorities reflected both his confidence in his own position and his recognition that the world was becoming increasingly interconnected. The embassies that he sent to distant courts carried not only political messages, but also scholars, artists, and craftsmen who served as ambassadors of Mughal culture and learning. Similarly, the foreign visitors who came to his court, including Jesuit missionaries, Persian poets, and Central Asian scholars, brought with them new ideas and perspectives that enriched the intellectual life of the empire. As Akbar's reign entered its final decades, the emperor, who had once been a 13-year-old boy struggling to maintain his grip on a precarious throne, had become one of the most powerful and respected rulers in the world. His empire stretched from the Himalayas to the Deccan, from the Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal, encompassing a population that numbered in the tens of millions and included people of every conceivable background and belief. The administrative systems he had created functioned with the smooth efficiency of a well-oiled machine. The revenues flowed steadily into the imperial treasury, and the cultural flowering that his patronage had encouraged was producing works of art, literature, and scholarship that would be admired for centuries to come. Yet Akbar was wise enough to understand that empires, like individual lives, are subject to the universal law of change, and that even the most successful reign must eventually come to an end. As he aged, he began to spend more time in contemplation, seeking to understand the deeper meaning of the extraordinary life he had lived and the legacy he would leave to his successors. The palace gardens where he walked in the cool hours of evening, their fountains playing among beds of roses and jasmine, became places of meditation where he could reflect on the great questions of human existence that had always fascinated him. The nature of justice, the relationship between power and responsibility, the ultimate purpose of human striving in a world where everything eventually passes away. The succession of Prince Salim to the Mughal throne as Emperor Jahangir in 1605 marked the beginning of a new chapter in the great story of empire, one that would be written not only in the language of conquest and administration, but also in the enduring vocabulary of art, architecture, and the cultivation of beauty as a form of imperial power. Where his father, Akbar, had been the great synthesizer, bringing together diverse traditions to create something unprecedented, Jahangir would prove to be the great aesthete, transforming the wealth and stability that Akbar had created into a golden age of artistic achievement that would leave its mark on the landscape of India for centuries to come. The early years of Jahangir's reign were shadowed by the complex relationship he had maintained with his father during the final decade of Akbar's life. The rebellion that Prince Salim had launched against the aging emperor had been born not merely of impatience for power, but of fundamental disagreements about the direction of the empire and the nature of imperial authority. Where Akbar had embraced religious experimentation and cultural synthesis, Salim had shown signs of favoring a more orthodox approach to Islamic governance. Yet when he finally ascended the throne, taking the title Jahangir, World Caesar, the new emperor revealed depths of character and vision that had been hidden beneath the surface of his earlier conflicts with his father. The court that gathered around Jahangir in the palaces of Agra and Lahore became a magnet for artists, poets, and craftsmen from across the known world. The emperor himself possessed a refined aesthetic sensibility that had been cultivated through years of exposure to the finest works of human creativity. His personal collection of paintings, many of which he had commissioned from the greatest masters of the age, revealed a patron who understood that art was not merely decoration, but a means of capturing and preserving the fleeting beauty of existence. The miniature paintings that flourished under his patronage achieved a level of technical perfection and emotional depth that had never been seen before. Their jewel-like colors and precise details creating windows into a world where every flower, every bird, every human expression was worthy of the most careful attention. The memoirs that Jahangir wrote throughout his reign, the Tuzuk-i-Jahangiri, provide a unique glimpse into the mind of an emperor who saw his role as encompassing not just the traditional responsibilities of rulership, but also the higher calling of cultural patronage and aesthetic refinement. His observations on everything from the behavior of animals in the imperial menagerie to the technical achievements of his court painters reveal a curiosity about the natural world and human creativity that was both scientifically rigorous and deeply personal. When he describes the first mango of the season or the changing colors of a sunset over the Yamuna River, his prose takes on the quality of poetry, transforming simple observations into meditations on the relationship between temporal power and eternal beauty. The architecture that was commissioned during Jahangir's reign began to show the influence of his more refined aesthetic sensibilities. While he did not undertake building projects on the scale that would characterize his son's reign, the structures that were completed under his patronage showed a new attention to decorative detail and a growing sophistication in the integration of different architectural traditions. The tomb that he planned for his father at Sikandra, though completed after his own death, exemplified the evolution of Mughal architecture toward greater elegance and symbolic complexity. Its geometric patterns and calligraphic inscriptions created a visual language that spoke of both imperial power and spiritual aspiration, while its garden setting suggested the Islamic concept of paradise as a place where earthly beauty served as a reflection of divine perfection. The empress who exerted the greatest influence on Jahangir's court was Mehr-un-Nisa, who would become famous to history as Nur Jahan, the light of the world. Her rise from the relatively modest background of a Persian immigrant family to become the most powerful woman in the Mughal Empire was a story that captured the imagination of contemporaries and continues to fascinate historians today. Nur Jahan possessed not only the beauty and intelligence that had first attracted the emperor's attention, but also the political acumen and cultural sophistication that allowed her to become his most trusted advisor and collaborator. Her influence extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of the imperial harem, encompassing matters of state policy, artistic patronage, and the cultivation of court culture. The gardens that were created during this period reflected the Mughal love of controlled nature and geometric perfection. The Shalimar Bagh in Kashmir, with its terraced lawns and cascading fountains, represented the fulfillment of the Persian dream of paradise, realized in the natural beauty of the Himalayan foothills. Here, surrounded by snow-capped peaks and reflected in the clear waters of Dal Lake, the imperial court could escape the heat and dust of the plains and enjoy the kind of perfect environment that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time. The emperor and his companions would spend hours in these gardens, composing poetry, listening to music, and engaging in the refined conversations that were considered essential to cultured life. The relationship between Jahangir and his son, Prince Khurram, who would later become Shah Jahan, was complex and sometimes troubled, marked by the same tensions between generations that had characterized Jahangir's own relationship with Akbar. Yet there was also a deep mutual respect and affection that would ultimately prove stronger than the temporary conflicts that arose from the prince's impatience to assume greater responsibilities. Khurram's military campaigns in the Deccan during his father's reign demonstrated the strategic skills and personal leadership that would later make him one of the most successful Mughal emperors, while his growing interest in architecture and artistic patronage showed that he had inherited his father's refined aesthetic sensibilities. The death of Jahangir in 1627, during his journey from Kashmir to Lahore, marked the end of an era characterized by consolidation, refinement, and the cultivation of beauty as an expression of imperial power. The emperor, who had once been known primarily for his conflicts with his father, was remembered by his subjects as a ruler who had brought peace, prosperity, and unprecedented artistic achievement to the empire. His tomb at Shadara, across the Ravi River from Lahore, would become a pilgrimage site for those who understood that great empires are measured not only by their military conquests, but also by their contributions to the sum of human beauty and knowledge. The succession of Shah Jahan to the throne in 1628 represented the culmination of the artistic and architectural trends that had been developing throughout the early decades of the 17th century. The new emperor brought to his position not only the military and administrative skills that had been honed during his service as a prince, but also a vision of imperial grandeur that would transform the Mughal Empire into one of the great architectural wonders of the world. His name, which meant King of the World, proved to be prophetic in ways that even he could not have imagined when he first adopted it. The early years of Shah Jahan's reign were marked by military campaigns that expanded Mughal control in the Deccan and consolidated the empire's position in Central Asia. Yet even during these periods of active warfare, the emperor's thoughts seemed to turn constantly to questions of artistic expression and architectural achievement. The plan for the great building projects that would define his reign began almost immediately after his accession, as if he understood that his ultimate legacy would be measured not in terms of territories conquered, but in terms of beauty created and preserved for future generations. The death of his beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal, in 1631, during the birth of their 14th child, provided both the emotional impetus and the thematic focus for the greatest of Shah Jahan's architectural achievements. The grief that the emperor felt at the loss of his closest companion was transformed into a determination to create a monument that would serve as both a tomb and a symbol of eternal love. The Taj Mahal, which began to take shape on the banks of the Yamuna River in Agra, would require more than 20 years to complete and would involve the labor of thousands of craftsmen from across the empire and beyond. The construction of the Taj Mahal was itself a masterpiece of organization and technical achievement. The white marble that forms the main structure was quarried in Rajasthan and transported hundreds of miles by river and road, while the precious stones used in the intricate inlay work were gathered from across Asia and beyond. The master craftsmen who supervised the work included not only Indian and Persian artists, but also specialists from as far away as Europe and Central Asia, all working together to realize a vision that combined the best elements of Islamic, Persian, and Indian architectural traditions. Yet the Taj Mahal was only the most famous of the architectural projects that transformed the Indian landscape during Shah Jahan's reign. The Red Fort in Delhi, with its massive walls and elegant pavilions, created a new standard for palace architecture that combined defensive necessity with aesthetic refinement. The Jama Masjid, the great Friday Mosque of Delhi, demonstrated that religious architecture could achieve grandeur and beauty without sacrificing the spiritual contemplation that was its ultimate purpose. The throne room where Shah Jahan held his daily audiences, with its famous inscription declaring that, "If there is paradise on earth, it is here, it is here, it is here," became a symbol of the Mughal claim to have created an earthly reflection of divine perfection. The court culture that flourished during Shah Jahan's reign reached levels of sophistication and refinement that were unmatched anywhere else in the contemporary world. The daily routine of imperial life followed protocols that had been refined through generations of practice, creating an environment where every gesture and every word carried symbolic meaning. The emperor himself moved through this elaborate ceremonial structure with the grace of someone who understood that majesty was not simply a matter of personal authority, but a collective artistic creation that involved everyone who participated in court life. The peacock throne, the magnificent seat of imperial power that Shah Jahan commissioned for his throne room, exemplified the fusion of political symbolism and artistic achievement that characterized his reign. Encrusted with precious stones and decorated with gold and silver work of extraordinary intricacy, the throne was not merely a piece of furniture, but a work of art that proclaimed the wealth and power of the empire to all who beheld it. The peacocks that gave the throne its name, crafted from gold and decorated with diamonds, rubies, and emeralds, spread their tails in a display of artificial beauty that rivaled anything found in nature. The gardens that were created during this period refined the Mughal tradition of landscape architecture to its highest level of achievement. The Char Bagh, the fourfold garden, became the standard template for imperial garden design, its geometric precision and symbolic complexity creating outdoor spaces that served as settings for both private contemplation and public ceremony. The Shalimar Gardens in Kashmir, expanded and refined during Shah Jahan's reign, became the ultimate expression of the Mughal vision of paradise realized on earth, their terraced lawns and reflecting pools creating a sense of perfect harmony between human artistry and natural beauty. Yet even as Shah Jahan was creating these monuments to imperial grandeur, the seeds of future difficulties were already being sown. The enormous cost of his building projects placed increasing strain on the imperial treasury, while the resources devoted to artistic patronage might have been used to strengthen the empire's military and administrative capabilities. More seriously, perhaps, the emperor's 4 sons were growing to maturity with ambitions and abilities that would inevitably lead to conflict over the succession. The wars that would eventually tear the empire apart were still years in the future, but the tensions that would fuel them were already beginning to build like storm clouds, gathering on a distant horizon. The illness that struck Shah Jahan in 1657 precipitated the succession crisis that had been brewing for years. As news of the emperor's condition spread throughout the empire, his sons began to position themselves for the struggle that would determine not only who would inherit the throne, but also what kind of empire the Mughals would become. The prince who would ultimately emerge victorious from this conflict, Aurangzeb, would prove to be a ruler of extraordinary ability and determination. But his reign would also mark the beginning of fundamental changes in the character and direction of the Mughal Empire. The Great War of Succession that erupted upon Shah Jahan's illness in 1657 marked the beginning of a new and more turbulent chapter in the history of the Mughal Empire, one that would see the empire reach its greatest territorial extent, while simultaneously sowing the seeds of its eventual decline. As the 4 sons of Shah Jahan marshaled their forces and prepared for the struggle that would determine the future of one of the world's great civilizations, the very air across northern India seemed to vibrate with anticipation and dread, like the tense moments before a monsoon storm breaks across the landscape in thunder and lightning. Prince Aurangzeb, the 3rd son of Shah Jahan, had spent the years of his father's reign serving as governor of the Deccan. where the harsh realities of frontier warfare had shaped him into a commander of exceptional skill and determination. Unlike his brothers, who had remained close to the refined atmosphere of the imperial court, Aurangzeb had learned to navigate the complex political landscape of peninsular India, where Mughal authority was constantly challenged by independent kingdoms, rebel nobles, and the rise of new powers like the Marathas. The experience had given him not only military expertise, but also a deep understanding of the administrative and financial challenges that faced the empire as it struggled to maintain control over its vast and diverse territories. The character that emerged from these years of provincial governance was markedly different from that of his predecessors. Where Akbar had been the great synthesizer and Shah Jahan the great patron of arts, Aurangzeb revealed himself to be the great purifier, a ruler whose vision of empire was shaped by an uncompromising commitment to Islamic orthodoxy and a determination to restore what he saw as the proper relationship between temporal power and divine authority. His personal piety was legendary even among contemporaries, his daily routine structured around the 5 prayers that marked the passage of time in the Islamic world. His simple lifestyle, a stark contrast to the magnificent luxury that had characterized the court during his father's reign. The War of Succession that began in 1657 and continued until 1659 was fought with a savagery that reflected the high stakes involved. Each of the brothers understood that victory would mean not only the throne, but survival itself, while defeat would likely mean death or permanent imprisonment. The battles that decided the contest, Dharmat, Samogar, and finally the decisive encounter at Kajwa, were marked by the kind of desperate courage that men display when they are fighting not just for victory, but for their lives and the lives of their children. When Aurangzeb finally emerged victorious from this bloodbath, he did so with the grim satisfaction of someone who had paid the full price for power and was prepared to exercise it without sentiment or hesitation. The coronation of Muhyiddin Muhammad Aurangzeb as Emperor Alamgir, world conqueror, in 1658 marked the beginning of a reign that would last for nearly half a century and transform the Mughal Empire in ways that would have profound consequences for the future of India. The new emperor brought to the throne not only the military skills and administrative experience that he had gained during his years as a prince, but also a vision of Islamic governance that represented a fundamental departure from the policies of religious tolerance and cultural synthesis that had characterized the empire under Akbar. The early years of Aurangzeb's reign were marked by a systematic effort to reverse what he saw as the dangerous innovations of his predecessors and to restore the empire to what he believed were proper Islamic principles. The policy of sulh-i-kul, universal peace, that had been the cornerstone of Akbar's approach to governing a diverse population was abandoned in favor of a more orthodox interpretation of the relationship between Muslim rulers and non-Muslim subjects. The jizya, the special tax on non-Muslims that had been abolished by Akbar, was reintroduced despite the economic hardship and political resentment that this decision created. Hindu temples that had been built or repaired during the previous reigns were destroyed, and restrictions were placed on Hindu festivals and religious practices that had previously been tolerated or even encouraged. Yet even as Aurangzeb was implementing these controversial domestic policies, he was also launching the military campaigns that would make his reign the period of the empire's greatest territorial expansion. The conquest of the Deccan kingdoms of Bijapur and Golconda, which was completed by 1687, brought vast new territories under Mughal control and seemed to fulfill the imperial dream of ruling the entire Indian subcontinent from the Himalayas to the southern seas. The wealth that flowed into the imperial treasury from these newly conquered provinces was enormous, the revenues from the Deccan alone exceeding those of entire European kingdoms, and allowing Aurangzeb to maintain armies larger than any that had previously served the Mughal cause. The administrative challenges posed by governing this expanded empire were immense, requiring innovations in military organization, revenue collection, and political control that stretched the existing imperial system to its limits. Aurangzeb proved himself to be an administrator of exceptional ability, personally supervising the details of governance with a dedication that bordered on obsession. His correspondence with provincial governors, military commanders, and revenue officials reveals a ruler who was intimately familiar with conditions throughout his domains, and who insisted on maintaining personal control over even relatively minor administrative decisions. The efficiency with which the expanded empire was governed during the early decades of his reign testified to both his own capabilities and the strength of the institutions that his predecessors had created. Yet the very success of these territorial conquests created new problems that would ultimately prove insoluble. The Maratha Confederation that emerged under the leadership of Shivaji Bhonsle represented a fundamentally different kind of challenge from the traditional enemies that the Mughals had faced in the past. Rather than seeking to replace Mughal rule with their own imperial system, the Marathas developed a form of guerrilla warfare that aimed to make Mughal control so costly and uncertain that the empire would eventually be forced to withdraw from the Deccan entirely. Their tactics of rapid movement, surprise attacks, and strategic withdrawal frustrated the traditional Mughal approach to warfare, which was based on the deployment of large armies and the conduct of formal sieges. The 27 years that Aurangzeb spent in the Deccan, from 1682 until his death in 1707, represented the longest continuous military campaign in Mughal history, and perhaps the most costly in terms of both human lives and imperial resources. The emperor, who had once been known for his careful financial management, found himself pouring the accumulated wealth of the empire into a military effort that seemed to consume resources without producing the decisive victory that would justify the enormous expenditure. The army that accompanied him to the south numbered in the hundreds of thousands and included not only soldiers, but also the vast civilian population. Craftsmen, merchants, administrators, and camp followers that was necessary to support such a massive military undertaking. The camp that moved with Aurangzeb through the hills and valleys of the Deccan was like a mobile city, a temporary metropolis that could be established and dismantled with the regularity of the seasons. The emperor's own tent, which served as both throne room and private residence, was surrounded by the pavilions of nobles and officers arranged according to strict protocols of rank and precedence. Beyond these lay the quarters of the common soldiers, the workshops where weapons and equipment were manufactured and repaired, the bazaars where merchants sold everything from food and clothing to books and luxury goods, and the hospitals where the wounded were treated and the sick were cared for. It was a complete society, organized around the single purpose of maintaining military pressure on enemies who seemed to vanish into the landscape whenever the imperial forces approached. The personal toll that these endless campaigns took on Aurangzeb was reflected in the letters and documents that he wrote during his later years. The confident young prince who had once dreamed of purifying the empire and restoring it to proper Islamic principles had become an old man worn down by the frustrations of trying to impose his will on a subcontinent that seemed to resist every effort at complete conquest. His correspondence with his children and grandchildren, many of whom he had not seen for years because of his constant absence on campaign, reveals a ruler who was increasingly isolated from the human connections that give meaning to life beyond the pursuit of power. The religious policies that had seemed so important to Aurangzeb in the early years of his reign gradually came to be seen as obstacles to the military success that had become his overriding obsession. The alienation of Hindu nobles and soldiers, who had been essential to Mughal military success since the time of Akbar, weakened the empire's ability to maintain control over its vast territories. The destruction of temples and the imposition of religious restrictions created resentment that the Marathas and other enemies of the empire were able to exploit, transforming local grievances into a broader resistance movement that challenged the legitimacy of Mughal rule itself. The economic consequences of Aurangzeb's prolonged military campaigns were equally devastating. The wealth that had been accumulated during the prosperous reigns of Jahangir and Shah Jahan was gradually dissipated in maintaining armies that grew larger and more expensive with each passing year. The taxations required to fund these military efforts imposed increasing burdens on the agricultural population, while the constant warfare disrupted trade and manufacturing throughout the Deccan and adjacent regions. The empire that had once been celebrated for its prosperity and economic growth was gradually transformed into a military state whose primary function was the maintenance of armies that seemed to exist for no purpose other than their own perpetuation. The succession arrangements that Aurangzeb made in his final years reflected his understanding that the empire he was leaving to his heirs was very different from the one he had inherited from Shah Jahan. The princes who would compete for the throne after his death had been shaped by decades of military campaigning and religious orthodoxy, their characters formed in an environment where compromise was seen as weakness and flexibility was interpreted as a betrayal of fundamental principles. The empire they would inherit would be larger than ever before, but it would also be financially exhausted, politically fragmented, and facing challenges that would require exactly the kind of pragmatic adaptation that Aurangzeb's own policies had made increasingly difficult. When death finally came to Aurangzeb in 1707, at the age of 88, it found him still in the Deccan, still pursuing the military campaigns that had consumed the last quarter century of his life. His funeral was conducted with the simple ceremonies that he had specified in his will, a stark contrast to the magnificent obsequies that had marked the passing of his predecessors. The grave that received his body was marked by a simple stone that bore only his name and the dates of his birth and death, a monument to humility that seemed to acknowledge the ultimate futility of all earthly ambitions. The empire that Aurangzeb left behind was, in many ways, the victim of its own success. The territorial conquests that had made it the largest empire in Indian history had also stretched its resources and administrative capabilities beyond their breaking point. The religious orthodoxy that had been intended to strengthen the empire's Islamic character had instead alienated many of the non-Muslim subjects whose loyalty and support were essential to effective governance. Most importantly, perhaps, the military focus that had dominated the later years of Aurangzeb's reign had transformed the empire from a balanced political system into a war machine that could function effectively only as long as it was engaged in active conquest. The death of Aurangzeb in 1707 marked the end of an era in more ways than the simple passing of a long-reigning emperor. As the news of his demise spread across the vast expanse of the Mughal Empire like ripples across a still pond, it became clear that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power that had sustained imperial authority for nearly 2 centuries. The empire that had once seemed as permanent and unshakable as the mountains themselves now revealed itself to be as fragile as morning mist, its apparent solidity dependent on forces that were already beginning to dissipate in the warming air of a new age. The war of succession that erupted among Aurangzeb's sons possessed none of the clarity or decisive resolution that had characterized similar conflicts in the past. Prince Bahadur Shah, who eventually emerged victorious and took the throne as Shah Alam Fuam, was already 63 years old when he began his reign, an elderly man assuming control of an empire that required the energy and vision of youth to address its mounting challenges. The battles that established his authority, fought at Jajau and other sites across northern India, were marked by a kind of weary brutality that suggested participants who were going through the motions of imperial warfare without the conviction that had once made such conflicts meaningful. The empire that Bahadur Shah inherited was like a magnificent palace that had begun to show cracks in its foundation. The territorial extent was greater than ever before, stretching from Kashmir in the north to the Kaveri River in the south, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the Bay of Bengal. Yet this very size had become a source of weakness rather than strength, creating administrative and military challenges that strained the imperial system beyond its capacity to respond effectively. The revenues that flowed into the central treasury, while still enormous by any historical standard, were no longer sufficient to maintain the kind of military presence that effective control of such vast territories required. The provincial governors who administered the empire's far-flung territories were gradually transforming themselves from imperial servants into semi-independent rulers who acknowledged Mughal suzerainty while conducting their own foreign relations and maintaining their own armies. This process of decentralization wasn't the result of deliberate policy, but rather the inevitable consequence of an imperial structure that could no longer maintain effective supervision over distant provinces. The governors of Bengal, Hyderabad, and Awadh began to behave more like autonomous monarchs than provincial administrators, their loyalty to the central government increasingly nominal and conditional. The Maratha Confederacy, which had emerged as the most serious challenge to Mughal authority during Aurangzeb's later years, continued to expand its influence throughout western and central India. Under the leadership of chiefs like Balaji Vishwanath and later his son Baji Rao, the Marathas developed a sophisticated system of government that combined military effectiveness with administrative efficiency. Their ability to raise revenues through taxation and tribute allowed them to maintain armies that were more mobile and better motivated than the increasingly unwieldy Mughal forces, while their knowledge of local terrain and political conditions gave them significant advantages in the guerrilla warfare that had proven so effective against imperial armies. The rise of the Sikhs in Punjab represented another challenge to Mughal authority, one that combined religious enthusiasm with military innovation in ways that proved particularly difficult for imperial forces to counter. The transformation of Sikhism from a peaceful religious movement into a militant community capable of sustained resistance against Muslim rule reflected broader changes in the political and social landscape of northern India. The Sikh misls, military confederations organized around shared religious and territorial interests, developed tactics and strategies that allowed them to maintain control over significant portions of Punjab, despite repeated attempts by Mughal armies to suppress their movement. Meanwhile, in the south, the kingdom of Mysore under Hyder Ali and later his son Tipu Sultan emerged as a formidable military power that successfully resisted both Mughal and British expansion. The innovations in military technology and organization that characterized Mysore's armies, including the extensive use of rockets and disciplined infantry formations, demonstrated that Indian rulers could adapt to changing conditions and develop effective responses to European military advantages. The wars between Mysore and the British East India Company would become some of the most fiercely contested conflicts of the 18th century, with implications that extended far beyond the immediate participants. The European trading companies that had established modest footholds along the Indian coast during the previous century were gradually transforming themselves into territorial powers with their own armies and administrative systems. The English East India Company, in particular, had begun to exploit the political fragmentation of post-Aurangzeb India to expand its influence far beyond the commercial activities that had originally justified its presence. The victories that company forces achieved over the Nawab of Bengal at Plassey in 1757 and over the combined forces of several Indian rulers at Buxar in 1764 demonstrated that European military organization and technology could be decisive factors in Indian political conflicts. The emperors who succeeded Bahadur Shah, Muhammad Shah, Ahmad Shah, Alamgir II, and their successors ruled over an empire that was increasingly unable to control events within its own supposed boundaries. The court that gathered around these later Mughal rulers retained much of the ceremonial magnificence that had characterized imperial life during the empire's golden age. But beneath this surface of continued grandeur lay a reality of diminished power and shrinking resources. The daily routines of palace life continued much as they had for generations, but the audiences where the emperor received petitions and the councils where policy was discussed dealt increasingly with problems that seemed to have no solutions. The invasion of Nadir Shah in 1739 represented perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of the empire's military weakness. The Persian conqueror's army moved across northern India with an ease that would have been unthinkable during the reigns of Akbar or Aurangzeb, defeating Mughal forces at Karnal and marching on Delhi almost unopposed. The sack of the imperial capital that followed was not merely a military disaster, but a psychological blow that shattered the aura of invincibility that had long surrounded Mughal power. The removal of the peacock throne and other treasures of the imperial court to Persia symbolized the end of an age when Delhi had been one of the great centers of world civilization. The administrative systems that had once been the empire's greatest strength were gradually breaking down under the weight of financial crisis and political fragmentation. The Mansabdari system that had provided the empire with its military and civilian officials was increasingly unable to attract capable individuals or maintain their loyalty once appointed. The revenue collection mechanisms that had generated the wealth necessary for imperial grandeur were disrupted by constant warfare and the growing independence of provincial authorities. The roads and communications networks that had knitted the empire together were becoming unsafe for travel, as bandits and rebellious groups made movement between different regions increasingly dangerous. The cultural and intellectual life that had flourished under imperial patronage was also beginning to show signs of decline and fragmentation. The great libraries and schools that had been centers of learning and artistic creation were struggling to maintain their activities as imperial support diminished and private patronage became increasingly important. The traditions of Persian poetry and scholarship that had enriched Mughal court culture were being gradually localized and regionalized, producing works of quality but losing the universal character that had made Mughal culture a unifying force throughout the empire. The religious policies that had been such a contentious issue during Aurangzeb's reign continued to create problems for his successors. The alienation of Hindu nobles and soldiers that had resulted from orthodox Islamic policies could not be easily reversed, while attempts to restore the more tolerant approach of earlier emperors were resisted by Muslim religious authorities who had gained influence during the previous reign. The empire found itself caught between the need to maintain the loyalty of its diverse population and the pressure to conform to religious principles that many of its subjects found objectionable. The economic foundation of imperial power was being gradually eroded by the combination of military expenditure, administrative inefficiency, and commercial competition from European trading companies. The revenues that had once flowed steadily into the imperial treasury were increasingly diverted to provincial authorities or lost entirely to regions that had effectively seceded from central control. The trade routes that had been a source of wealth for centuries were being disrupted by political instability and the development of maritime alternatives that bypassed traditional overland passages. Yet even as the empire struggled with these mounting challenges, there were still moments when something of its former greatness seemed to shine through the gathering darkness. The reign of Muhammad Shah, despite its ultimate failure to restore imperial authority, saw a remarkable flowering of art and literature that suggested the continued vitality of Mughal culture even in the face of political decline. The poets and painters who gathered around his court produced works that captured both the melancholy of an ending age and the enduring beauty of traditions that had been cultivated over centuries of imperial patronage. The palace life that continued in Delhi and other imperial centers retained much of its formal magnificence, even as the substance of power was slipping away. The ceremonies that marked the passage of seasons and the celebration of festivals proceeded with the same elaborate protocol that had characterized them for generations, creating an atmosphere of continuity that masked the fundamental changes that were transforming the empire's position in the world. The gardens where emperors had once walked in contemplation of their vast dominions were still maintained with care, their fountains still playing among beds of roses and jasmine. But the thoughts of those who walked there now were increasingly focused on survival rather than expansion. As the 18th century progressed and the challenges facing the empire continued to multiply, it became increasingly clear that the age of Mughal dominance was drawing to a close. The empire that had once seemed destined to rule India indefinitely was revealing itself to be subject to the same laws of rise and decline that had governed all previous imperial systems. Yet the transformation that was occurring wasn't simply a matter of political collapse, but rather a complex process of adaptation and evolution that would ultimately give birth to new forms of organization and identity throughout the Indian subcontinent. The legacy of 2 centuries of Mughal rule could not be simply erased by political change or military defeat. The administrative practices, cultural traditions, architectural achievements, and artistic innovations that had been developed during the empire's golden age would continue to influence Indian civilization long after the last Mughal emperor had ceased to exercise real political power. The question that remained was whether these influences would be preserved and developed by new forms of Indian political organization or would be gradually displaced by the very different traditions and practices that European colonial authorities were beginning to introduce to the subcontinent. The morning sun that rose over Delhi in the year 1803 illuminated a city that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the ebb and flow of empire, and the inexorable passage of time that transforms even the mightiest human achievements into memories preserved in stone and story. As the light gradually spread across the Red Fort and the surrounding streets, it revealed an imperial capital that still maintained the outward forms of grandeur, while concealing beneath its magnificent surface a reality of power so diminished that it had become almost purely ceremonial. The Emperor Shah Alam II, who sat upon the throne of Timur and Akbar, exercised authority that extended little beyond the walls of his own palace, while the real governance of northern India was gradually passing into the hands of forces that his ancestors could never have imagined. The British East India Company, which had begun its involvement in Indian affairs as a humble trading concern, seeking nothing more than commercial advantage, had evolved through the crucible of 18th-century conflicts into a territorial power capable of matching and defeating the traditional rulers of the subcontinent. The transformation was so gradual and seemingly natural that many contemporaries failed to recognize its full significance until the process was already irreversible. The company's armies, organized along European lines, but increasingly manned by Indian soldiers, trained in Western military techniques, had proven their effectiveness in conflicts with both Indian rulers and European rivals, establishing a pattern of expansion that seemed to follow its own internal logic, regardless of the original intentions of those who directed it. The subsidiary alliance system that the company's administrators developed during the final decades of the 18th century represented a masterstroke of political innovation that allowed them to control vast territories without the expense and difficulty of direct administration. Under this system, Indian rulers who accepted British protection and agreed to maintain company troops within their territories could continue to govern their subjects according to traditional methods, while effectively surrendering control over their external relations and military affairs. It was a form of indirect rule that preserved the forms of traditional authority while hollowing out their substance, creating a network of dependent states that served British interests while maintaining the illusion of indigenous political autonomy. The Mughal emperor, who had once commanded the loyalty of governors and nobles from Kashmir to the Deccan, found himself reduced to the status of a pensioner dependent on British support for his very survival. The monthly stipend that the company provided in exchange for formal recognition of their authority represented both the emperor's continued symbolic importance and his complete practical irrelevance to the actual governance of his former domains. The court ceremonies that continued to be performed in the Red Fort took on an increasingly theatrical quality, elaborate performances of a political tradition that had lost connection with real power, but retained enough emotional resonance to be worth preserving for its propaganda value. The sepoys who served in the company's armies were drawn primarily from the same populations that had once filled the ranks of Mughal forces, but their training, equipment, and leadership reflected the military innovations that European warfare had developed during centuries of continental conflict. The discipline and coordination that characterized these new military formations gave them significant advantages over traditional Indian armies, but they also created new forms of tension and resentment that would eventually explode in ways that the company's administrators failed to anticipate. The cultural and religious differences between British officers and Indian soldiers were exacerbated by policies that seemed designed to undermine traditional practices and beliefs, creating conditions that would ultimately prove conducive to widespread rebellion. The economic transformation that accompanied the company's political expansion had profound consequences for every level of Indian society. The traditional systems of revenue collection and agricultural organization that had evolved over centuries of Mughal rule were gradually replaced by new methods designed to maximize the extraction of wealth for British commercial and strategic purposes. The zamindari system that was implemented in Bengal and other regions created a class of landlords who served as intermediaries between the company administration and the agricultural population. But it also disrupted traditional relationships between rulers and subjects that had provided stability and continuity for generations. The cultural policies that the company began to implement during the early decades of the 19th century reflected a growing confidence in the superiority of European civilization and a corresponding contempt for Indian traditions and practices. The educational reforms that were introduced with the stated goal of improving the condition of the Indian population were designed primarily to create a class of Indian administrators capable of serving British interests efficiently and reliably. The emphasis on English language instruction and European curriculum represented not just a practical adaptation to new political realities, but a fundamental challenge to the cultural foundations of Indian civilization. Yet even as the company was extending its control over larger and larger portions of the subcontinent, the traditional forms of resistance to foreign rule were evolving in ways that would ultimately prove more effective than the military campaigns and diplomatic intrigues that had characterized earlier periods of political conflict. The religious revival movements that emerged in various parts of India during this period combined spiritual renewal with political opposition, creating forms of resistance that drew their strength from sources that British administrators found difficult to understand or counteract. The Wahhabi movement in northern India, the various Sufi orders that maintained their influence in Muslim communities, and the Hindu reform movements that sought to purify and strengthen traditional religious practices all contributed to a growing sense of Indian identity that transcended the regional and sectarian divisions that had previously facilitated foreign conquest. The reign of Bahadur Shah II, who ascended the Mughal throne in 1837, represented the last flicker of imperial authority before the final collapse of the dynasty that had once ruled much of the Indian subcontinent. The emperor who took the title, Bahadur Shah Zafar, was a man of genuine cultural accomplishments, a poet whose verses captured both the melancholy of an ending age and the enduring beauty of traditions that had been cultivated through centuries of imperial patronage. His court, though reduced in political significance, remained a center of literary and artistic activity that attracted scholars and artists from throughout the Islamic world. The daily routines of palace life continued much as they had for generations, creating an atmosphere of continuity that provided comfort and stability in an age of rapid and often bewildering change. The uprising that began in 1857 with the mutiny of sepoy regiments at Meerut and quickly spread throughout northern India represented the most serious challenge to British rule that the company had yet faced. The rebellion that followed was not simply a military revolt, but a complex social and political movement that drew support from diverse groups united primarily by their opposition to the transformations that British rule was imposing on Indian society. The rebels who gathered around the restored authority of Bahadur Shah Zafar included not only disaffected soldiers, but also displaced nobles, dispossessed landlords, religious leaders, and ordinary people who had suffered under the economic and social disruptions of the previous decades. The siege of Delhi that lasted from May to September 1857 became the symbolic center of the entire rebellion, the place where the future of British rule in India would be decided through the harsh arbitration of military force. The city that had been the capital of the Mughal Empire for centuries became a battlefield where the two different visions of India's future confronted each other with a violence that reflected the fundamental incompatibility of their respective goals and values. The emperor, who had been reluctantly drawn into the leadership of the rebellion, found himself presiding over a movement that sought to restore not just Mughal political authority, but the entire traditional order that British rule was systematically undermining. The eventual British victory at Delhi in September 1857 marked not just the end of the rebellion, but the final collapse of the Mughal Empire as even a symbolic political force. The trial of Bahadur Shah Zafar that followed his capture was conducted with the forms of legal procedure, but its outcome was predetermined by political necessities that left no room for clemency or compromise. The emperor, who had once been addressed with all the elaborate titles and honorifics that befitted the heir of Timur and Akbar, was reduced to the status of a common criminal, his very existence now seen as a threat to the stability of British rule that could only be eliminated through exile or execution. The decision to exile Bahadur Shah Zafar to Rangoon rather than execute him reflected both British uncertainty about the wisdom of creating a martyr and their recognition that the aged emperor posed no real military threat to their continued dominance. The journey from Delhi to his place of exile was like a funeral procession for an entire imperial tradition. The last emperor of the Mughals traveling under guard through territories that his ancestors had once ruled with absolute authority. The small house in Rangoon where he spent his final years became a kind of prison where the remnants of a great dynasty were allowed to fade away in obscurity, far from the lands and peoples who had once looked to Mughal authority for justice and protection. The death of Bahadur Shah Zafar in 1862 marked the formal end of the Mughal Empire, though the dynasty's political significance had already been extinguished 5 years earlier with the suppression of the rebellion. The funeral that was conducted in Rangoon was attended by only a handful of mourners, a stark contrast to the magnificent obsequies that had marked the passing of earlier emperors. The grave that received the last emperor's body was marked by a simple stone that bore only his name and dates, a monument to humility that seemed to acknowledge the ultimate futility of all earthly ambitions, yet also a reminder of the human dignity that survives even the most complete political defeat. The British Raj that emerged from the ashes of the Mughal Empire represented a fundamentally different approach to governing the Indian subcontinent, one based on European concepts of administration, law, and economic organization that had little connection to the traditions and practices that had evolved over centuries of Islamic rule. The Government of India Act of 1858, which transferred authority from the East India Company to the British Crown, created new institutions and procedures that were designed to make British rule more efficient and systematic. But it also completed the process of displacing indigenous political traditions that had begun with the company's initial territorial expansion. Yet even as the formal structures of Mughal authority were being dismantled and replaced, the cultural legacy of 3 centuries of imperial rule continued to influence every aspect of Indian life. The Urdu language that had emerged from the interaction between Persian court culture and local Indian traditions remained the lingua franca of educated society throughout northern India. The architectural monuments that Mughal emperors had commissioned continued to dominate the landscape of major cities, serving as permanent reminders of an age when Indian rulers had created works of art and beauty that rivaled anything produced elsewhere in the world. The administrative practices, legal concepts, and social customs that had been developed during the empire's golden age provided templates and precedents that continued to shape Indian civilization long after the political system that had created them had passed into history. The process by which the British gradually assumed control over the institutions and territories that had once comprised the Mughal Empire was not simply a matter of military conquest or political manipulation. It involved a complex transformation of economic relationships, social structures, and cultural practices that touched every level of Indian society and created new forms of identity and organization that would ultimately provide the foundation for the independence movement that would emerge in the following century. The railway networks that connected distant regions, the telegraph systems that allowed rapid communication across vast distances, and the educational institutions that trained new generations of Indians in European knowledge and techniques all contributed to the creation of a more unified and interconnected subcontinent than had ever existed under traditional forms of imperial rule. As the 19th century progressed and British rule became more firmly established, the memory of Mughal greatness began to take on a nostalgic quality that transformed it from a political reality into a cultural symbol. The poets and writers who looked back on the age of Akbar and Shah Jahan increasingly portrayed it as a golden age of tolerance, prosperity, and artistic achievement that stood in implicit contrast to the more utilitarian and culturally insensitive character of European colonial administration. This romanticization of the Mughal past would eventually contribute to the development of Indian nationalism and the movement for independence, as later generations of Indians looked to their own imperial tradition as evidence of their capacity for self-governance and cultural achievement. In the gathering twilight of the 19th century, as the last echoes of Mughal authority faded into the realm of memory and legend, the Indian subcontinent began the long process of coming to terms with the end of an imperial tradition that had shaped its destiny for more than 3 centuries. The monuments that Mughal emperors had built still rose majestically from the landscape, the Taj Mahal continuing to gleam like a pearl in the moonlight, the Red Fort still dominating the horizon of Delhi, the gardens of Kashmir still reflecting the snow-capped peaks in their tranquil waters, but they now served as reminders of vanished greatness rather than symbols of living power. The empire had become a ghost. Its presence felt everywhere, but its substance dissolved into the mists of a past that seemed both incredibly distant and intimately present. The British officials who now administered the territories that had once formed the heart of the Mughal Empire found themselves serving as reluctant custodians of a cultural heritage that they often failed to understand, but could not entirely ignore. The archaeological surveys that were conducted during the latter half of the 19th century revealed the extraordinary scope and sophistication of Mughal architectural achievement, forcing European observers to acknowledge that the civilization they had displaced had been capable of creating works of art and engineering that rivaled anything produced in their own countries. The reports compiled by scholars like James Ferguson and photographers like Felice Beato documented not only the physical remains of imperial grandeur, but also the gradual process of decay and neglect that threatened to erase these monuments from the landscape entirely. The restoration projects that were undertaken by the Archaeological Survey of India represented both an attempt to preserve the physical legacy of the Mughal period and a fundamental transformation in the way that this heritage was understood and presented. The monuments that had once served as working elements of a living imperial system were gradually converted into museum pieces, objects of historical and artistic interest that could be appreciated by visitors but no longer functioned as centers of political or religious activity. The Taj Mahal, which Shah Jahan had conceived as a tomb that would serve as an eternal symbol of his love for Mumtaz Mahal, became a tourist destination whose beauty was divorced from the personal and political contexts that had given it meaning for its creators. The scholarly research that accompanied these preservation efforts gradually revealed the complexity and sophistication of Mughal administrative and cultural achievements. The Persian and Urdu manuscripts that were discovered in palace libraries and private collections documented systems of governance, revenue collection, and legal administration that had functioned with remarkable efficiency for centuries. The chronicles compiled by court historians like Abul Fazl and Abd al-Qadir Badauni provided detailed accounts of imperial policies and personalities that challenged European assumptions about the nature of Oriental despotism, and revealed instead a tradition of thoughtful and often innovative approaches to the challenges of governing a diverse and complex society. The language that had served as the primary medium of Mughal court culture, Urdu, that magnificent synthesis of Persian vocabulary and Hindi grammar, continued to flourish as a literary language even after the political system that had nurtured its development had disappeared. The poets who wrote in the decades following the collapse of the empire, figures like Mirza Ghalib and Muhammad Iqbal, produced works that captured both the melancholy of cultural decline and the enduring vitality of traditions that had been shaped by centuries of imperial patronage. Their verses often reflected explicitly on the contrast between past greatness and present subordination, creating a literary tradition that would eventually contribute to the development of Indian nationalism and the movement for independence from British rule. The architectural influence of Mughal building traditions continued to shape construction throughout the subcontinent long after the empire itself had ceased to exist. The Indo-Saracenic style that emerged during the British period represented an attempt to combine European structural techniques with decorative elements derived from Mughal and other Indian architectural traditions. Buildings like the Victoria Memorial in Calcutta and the Gateway of India in Bombay demonstrated both the continuing appeal of Mughal aesthetic principles and the transformation of these principles to serve very different political and cultural purposes than those for which they had originally been developed. The administrative practices that had been developed during the Mughal period also continued to influence governance throughout India during the colonial period and beyond. The revenue collection systems that had been refined under Akbar and his successors provided templates that British administrators adapted for their own purposes, while the concepts of centralized authority combined with local autonomy that had characterized Mughal governance would eventually inform the federal structures that independent India adopted in the 20th century. The Mansabdari system of ranking and promotion, though formally abolished, established precedents for merit-based administration that would resurface in various forms throughout the subsequent history of Indian governance. Yet perhaps the most important legacy of the Mughal Empire was not to be found in its institutional or artistic achievements, but rather in the vision of cultural synthesis and religious tolerance that had been most fully developed during the reign of Akbar. The idea that a diverse society could be governed effectively without requiring the complete cultural assimilation of minority populations represented a contribution to political thought that would prove increasingly relevant as the modern world struggled with questions of multiculturalism and religious coexistence. The festivals and cultural practices that had emerged from the interaction between different communities during the Mughal period continued to provide models for intercommunal harmony, even as the political framework that had originally encouraged such synthesis had been replaced by systems that often emphasized division rather than unity. The independence movement that eventually succeeded in ending British rule in India drew inspiration from many sources, but the memory of Mughal greatness played an important role in convincing Indians that they possessed their own traditions of the political organization and cultural achievement that were worthy of preservation and development. The nationalist leaders who emerged during the first half of the 20th century often referred explicitly to the Mughal period as evidence that India had been capable of creating unified and prosperous political systems without European guidance or supervision. The Congress Party and the Muslim League, despite their fundamental disagreements about the future of the subcontinent, both claimed to represent legitimate heirs to the imperial tradition that the British had interrupted but not destroyed. The partition of India in 1947, which created separate nations for Hindus and Muslims, represented in many ways the final rejection of the Mughal vision of unity in diversity. The communal violence that accompanied independence demonstrated how completely the tolerant and inclusive approach to religious differences that had characterized the empire's golden age had been replaced by the politics of separation and mutual suspicion. Yet even as the subcontinent was being divided along religious lines, many of the cultural and artistic traditions that had been nurtured during the 18th century Mughal period continued to flourish on both sides of the new border, providing evidence of deep connections that political boundaries could not entirely sever. The archaeological discoveries that continued throughout the 20th century gradually revealed the full extent of Mughal architectural and artistic achievement. The excavations conducted at sites like Fatehpur Sikri uncovered evidence of sophisticated urban planning and engineering that had previously been unknown, while the restoration of monuments like the Shalimar Gardens in Kashmir demonstrated the extraordinary skill with which Mughal landscape architects had integrated natural beauty with human artistry. The techniques developed for preserving and restoring these monuments have provided valuable experience for conservation efforts throughout the world, contributing to international understanding of how to maintain cultural heritage in the face of environmental threats and human negligence. The scholarly study of Mughal history that has developed over the past century has revealed the empire to have been far more complex and sophisticated than earlier European observers had recognized. The research conducted by historians like Irfan Habib, John F. Richards, and Catherine Asher has documented the economic, social, and cultural dynamics that sustained imperial authority for more than 3 centuries, while the work of art historians like Ebba Kork has revealed the aesthetic principles and symbolic meanings that informed Mughal architectural and artistic production. This scholarship has demonstrated that the Mughal Empire represented not simply another example of Oriental despotism, but rather a unique and innovative approach to the challenges of governing a diverse society in the early modern world. The contemporary relevance of Mughal political and cultural achievements has become increasingly apparent as modern nations struggle with questions of religious and ethnic diversity that were central concerns for Mughal administrators. The policies of religious tolerance and cultural synthesis that were developed during Akbar's reign have been studied as potential models for societies seeking to accommodate minority populations without compromising national unity. The administrative techniques that allowed the empire to govern effectively across vast distances and diverse populations have provided insights for modern attempts to create federal systems that balance central authority with local autonomy. The tourism industry that has developed around Mughal monuments has created new forms of economic activity, while also raising important questions about how cultural heritage should be preserved and presented to contemporary audiences. The millions of visitors who travel each year to see the Taj Mahal, the Red Fort, and other Mughal sites contribute significantly to local and national economies, but their presence also creates conservation challenges that require careful management to prevent damage to irreplaceable historical structures. The development of sustainable tourism practices at these sites has become a model for heritage conservation efforts throughout the world. The literary and artistic traditions that emerged from Mughal court culture continue to influence contemporary creative work throughout South Asia and beyond. The ghazal form that was perfected by poets like Ghalib has been adapted by modern writers and musicians, while the decorative techniques developed by Mughal craftsmen continue to inspire contemporary artists and designers. The fusion of different cultural traditions that was characteristic of Mughal art has provided a model for contemporary attempts to create global artistic languages that draw from multiple sources while maintaining coherent aesthetic visions. As the 21st century progresses and the world becomes increasingly interconnected, The Mughal experiment in cultural synthesis and political integration has acquired new relevance for societies seeking to navigate between the forces of globalization and the preservation of local traditions. The empire that once seemed to represent merely another example of pre-modern autocracy has come to be recognized as a sophisticated attempt to create unity while preserving diversity, to maintain central authority while respecting local autonomy, and to govern effectively across cultural boundaries that had previously seemed insurmountable. The ruins that dot the landscape of northern India, abandoned cities like Fatehpur Sikri, crumbling tombs in forgotten villages, garden pavilions slowly being reclaimed by jungle growth, serve as melancholy reminders of the impermanence of all human achievements, no matter how magnificent or seemingly permanent they may appear to their creators. Yet these same ruins also testify to the enduring power of human creativity and aspiration, to the capacity of individuals and societies to create works of beauty and meaning that outlast the political systems that brought them into being. The empire may have fallen, but the monuments it created continue to inspire wonder and admiration, while the ideas and practices it developed continue to inform contemporary attempts to build just and prosperous societies. In the end, perhaps, the true legacy of the Mughal Empire lies not in any specific institutional or artistic achievement, but rather in its demonstration that human beings are capable of transcending the divisions of religion, ethnicity, and culture that seem to separate them, creating forms of civilization that celebrate diversity while maintaining unity, that honor tradition while embracing innovation, and that recognize the divine spark that exists within all people, regardless of their particular beliefs or backgrounds. The empire that began with a young prince's dream of conquest in the mountains of Central Asia had become, by the time of its dissolution, something far more significant than its founders could have imagined, a testament to the highest possibilities of human political and cultural achievement, and a source of inspiration for all those who continue to believe that it is possible to build societies based on justice, beauty, and mutual respect. The whisper of history that can still be heard in the corridors of the Red Fort, in the gardens of the Taj Mahal, in the verses of Mughal poets, and in the memories preserved by communities throughout South Asia, speaks not only of what was lost when the empire fell, but also of what endures when human beings commit themselves to the creation of beauty, the pursuit of justice, and the celebration of the magnificent diversity that characterizes our shared human heritage. In that whisper, the Mughal Empire lives on, not as a political reality, but as an inspiration and a reminder of what becomes possible when power is guided by wisdom, when authority is tempered by compassion, and when the dream of creating paradise on earth motivates the daily work of governance and the patient cultivation of civilization. He would be forgotten by most of his former subjects, and remembered only by a handful of scholars and poets who understood the magnitude of what had been lost. Yet the story of the Mughal Empire was not simply one of rise and fall, conquest and defeat, but rather a complex narrative of cultural synthesis, artistic achievement, and political innovation that had created new forms of civilization and left permanent marks on the landscape of the Indian subcontinent. The monuments and traditions, The languages and literatures, the administrative practices and artistic techniques that had been developed during 3 centuries of Mughal rule would continue to influence Indian civilization for generations to come, providing both inspiration and guidance for future attempts to create unity and prosperity in a land of extraordinary diversity and complexity.